There are moments that split a life in two, before and after. For James, a rancher buried under drought and debt, that moment came in the form of a silent, 12-year-old boy with haunted eyes, and no one left to claim him. What began as a desperate transaction turned into something that would challenge every belief James held about right, wrong, and what it means to save a life. But as the boy's past surfaced and James's guilt deepened, their journey took a turn no one could have predicted. This isn't just a story about rescue. It's a story about redemption, about the kind of love that isn't earned, but rebuilt, day by day, through fire, silence, and second chances. Before you watch, ask yourself, what would you do if saving someone else meant confronting the worst part of yourself? The wind never stopped in Dry Willow, Texas. Not even on the day James Coulter stood on the porch of his dying ranch, had clenched in one hand, foreclosure letter in the other, watching the dirt swirl like some ghost of everything he'd lost. It wasn't just a piece of land folding under drought and debt. It was the graveyard of his father's dreams and his grandfather's sacrifice. And now he, the third in a line of proud ranchers, couldn't even look his cows in the eye as he poured the last of the feed like an apology. His wife had left 6 years earlier. The barn had collapsed last spring, and now he was down to 3 horses, 2 cows, and a name no bank would lend to. Yet pride kept him from leaving, from calling his brother who'd gone into real estate and told him long ago, "This land is a curse, James. It'll take everything from you." But James didn't believe in curses until now, until he sat alone each night, chewing on silence, unable to afford the whiskey that used to quiet his thoughts. And it was in this silence that he first saw the ad in the back of the town's weekly paper. Labor available. Age 12. No guardians. Speaks little English. Cheap. Will work sunup to sundown. No complaints. The kind of ad no decent man should read twice. But James did. Not because he was heartless, but because the idea of help, any help, pulsed like a desperate vein beneath his ribs. He drove 2 hours south to a junkyard-looking place, where children weren't crying or smiling, just standing, lined up like tools, like livestock. And it was the third one from the left, a boy with hair too long and shoes too small, who met James's eyes without blinking, not curious, not afraid, just blank, as if he'd already accepted a life of silence. The man running the place called him Tommy, though the boy said nothing. And when James asked where he came from, the man said Mexico, maybe, who cares? Like borders were just paper and people just things, and James hated him. Hated this whole sick thing. But he was also $143 from homelessness, and every cattle auction laughed at his bids. So he handed over $500 cash, half his emergency stash, and led the boy, Tommy, or whoever he really was, into the truck without a word. On the drive back, neither spoke. The radio broken, the silence so thick it felt like sin. And James tried to see him as a worker, a pair of hands. But in the rearview mirror was a child, skin too thin, lips pressed together like every word he'd ever wanted to say had been stolen from him. And James hated himself for thinking of him as anything less than human. When they reached the ranch, the boy didn't ask where he'd sleep or what he'd eat. He just followed. Instructions: hose down the horses, stack hay, scrape the troughs. No protest, no questions, just movement. And James watched, not with satisfaction but with shame, because the truth was he didn't save the boy. He bought him. And that difference gnawed at him during every meal they didn't share. Every night he heard the boy cough from the drafty shed while James sat inside nursing cold beans. One morning, James left a peanut butter sandwich by the shed door, and it was gone by noon. No thank you. No note, just absence. And that tiny acceptance moved something in James more than any loan or sale ever had. The days turned hotter, the cattle thinner, and the boy, though clearly not used to ranch work, adapted quickly, too quickly, like someone used to punishment, used to hunger, used to surviving, not living. And James began to notice the small things, the way Tommy flinched at loud noises, how he worked through pain, how he avoided mirrors, and he began to wonder what kind of life had trained a child to be invisible. One night, James heard crying, not sobbing, not loud, just a wet, rhythmic inhale-exhale like someone trying hard to remember how to breathe. And he stood outside the shed listening, knowing he should knock, say something. But he didn't, because shame still shackled him. And so the boy cried alone while the man who bought him leaned against a wall, feeling less like a savior and more like a thief. The next day, James gave him gloves, real ones, not the torn pair he'd been using, and the boy paused for just a second before taking them, as if unsure he deserved them. And that look, that flicker of disbelief, undid James more than all the droughts and debts combined. By week's end, they had a rhythm: morning chores, quiet lunches, evening fence checks. And though no words passed between them, something else did, something deeper, older, like two people who knew pain didn't need explanation to be understood. One afternoon, the boy helped pull a calf from a struggling cow, arms bloodied and shaking, but he didn't flinch, just held tight and followed James's lead. And afterward, when the calf was breathing and James said, "Good job," the boy didn't smile, but for the first time he looked at James not with blankness, but with something fragile and terrifying: hope. It was then James realized that healing doesn't come with apologies or explanations. It comes with time, with actions, with small gestures like clean gloves or a sandwich or a single word of praise. And though he still didn't know the boy's real name or past, he knew that the child standing in his barn wasn't a burden or tool. He was someone who had been stolen and needed to be returned, not to a place, but to himself. And so, under the unforgiving Texas sun, a bond began to grow. Not fast, not easy, but real. The kind of bond that doesn't start with trust, but with survival. And James, once a man buried under debts and mistakes, began to find purpose not in saving his ranch, but in saving what was left of this child, and maybe, in the process, saving what was left of himself. James hadn't expected anything to change, not really. Not the dry soil under his boots, not the zero balance in his bank account, not the weary creak of the ranch gate every morning. But there was something about the way the boy moved across the fields, quiet and careful, like he was learning the language of the land by heart. And in that stillness, James found himself watching more closely, not just the child but himself, because the truth was, no man ever makes a deal like that and walks away clean. Every sunrise brought more than work. It brought questions James didn't have answers to. Who sells a child for $500? What kind of world allows that? And worse, what kind of man accepts it? He hadn't told anyone, not the feed store clerk, not the mechanic, not even old Merle from the next ranch over who'd drop by sometimes to drink lukewarm coffee and trade gossip. The boy's presence was a secret James carried like a wound, hidden beneath denim and silence. And yet, with each passing day, that wound didn't fester. It softened, not healed, not forgiven, but softened by the way Tommy always rose before dawn, how he never left a tool out of place, how he shared nothing but carried everything. And it was on a Tuesday when James saw the boy barefoot in the paddock at dusk, one hand on the neck of a wounded mare, whispering something too quiet to hear. And the mare, usually skittish, stood still as if calmed by magic. But James didn't believe in magic, only trauma. And this wasn't magic. It was knowing pain too well to cause it. And something in James broke a little watching that a child could carry such weight, yet still offer peace to a dying animal, something James himself hadn't managed to do in years. After that, James began to teach, not formally, not with words, but with gestures. How to mend fences without slicing your hand, how to lead a cow gently, how to load hay without wasting your back. And the boy watched with eyes that missed nothing, still never asking for anything. But one evening, as they sat under the barn eaves to escape a rare summer rain, James found a half-eaten apple next to him, and though it seemed small, almost silly, it meant the world. It meant the boy had chosen to share, to offer something, even if it was just fruit. And that silent gesture outweighed any words James could have said. But still, the guilt lingered, because no matter how well Tommy worked, no matter how their routines aligned, James couldn't forget the day of the deal. The man who'd pocketed his cash without blinking, the way the boy hadn't looked back. And one sleepless night, driven by shame more than curiosity, James drove back to that same dusty junkyard of lost children. But the place was gone. No trailers, no fence, just tire tracks and dust and the memory of a dozen blank stares that haunted him like ghosts. And he stood there alone, heart pounding, realizing that not only had he bought a child, but he may have been his only shot at survival. On the drive back, The radio static seemed louder than usual, a white noise that reminded him of the noise in his own head, and by the time he returned home, the boy was asleep in the shed, arms curled around himself, and James stood in the doorway longer than he should have, wanting to say something, anything, but all he managed was to leave an old flannel blanket folded at the door, and the next morning, the boy wore it draped over his shoulders as he watered the cattle. No words exchanged, just a slight nod, acknowledgement, acceptance, maybe even trust. Weeks turned to months. The ranch held together by spit, string, and their silent partnership. And then came the phone call. Unexpected, unwanted. A lawyer from Amarillo asking for James by name, saying there was an issue with the land deed, something about back taxes from his father's era that hadn't been processed properly. And suddenly, James was facing not just debt, but the real possibility of losing the ranch altogether, unless he could pay $7,800 within 60 days. And he laughed, not because it was funny, but because the world seemed to enjoy kicking a man already on his knees. And as he hung up the phone, Tommy appeared at the doorway, face unreadable, eye steady, and James didn't explain, didn't vent, just handed him the feed list and walked out. Because what do you tell a boy you bought for labor but grew to care for like kin? That you might lose the only home he's known since the shed? That you failed again? But that night, as James sat in the barn running numbers on crumpled paper, Tommy entered carrying something he'd never touched before, James's old guitar, dusty and silent for years, and though he didn't play, he held it gently, reverently, and simply placed it beside James before walking away. And somehow, that gesture, offering back something that meant the world to James, meant more than comfort. It meant I see you. And James, for the first time, cried, not loudly, not broken, just a quiet release of years of shame. And the guitar sat between them like a symbol of something fragile being slowly rebuilt. The days that followed were hard. Work doubled, money tightened, but something else grew too. Resilience. And one afternoon, when Merle dropped by unexpectedly and asked who the kid was, James didn't say a worker or a helper. He said, he's with me. And the boy, overhearing, paused just slightly, as if those 3 words were the first bricks of a home he'd never dared to imagine. James began selling off scrap parts, offering horse rides to local kids on weekends, anything to raise the money. And every time he looked up, Tommy was there, never asked to, never told, just there. And it was then James understood the true cost of the deal he'd made. Not $500, but the responsibility of another soul, one who now, inexplicably, trusted him enough to stay, to work, to give. Because what they were building wasn't just survival anymore. It was something like family, fragile, and wordless and messy, but real. And though the boy still didn't talk, he began to hum, soft and low while mucking stalls, a tune James didn't recognize, but began to carry with him like a prayer. And one night, as the fire cracked and the stars hung low, James found himself talking, not at the boy, but to him, telling stories about his father, about how the ranch used to buzz with life, how he messed up his marriage, how his brother never came back for Christmas. And though the boy said nothing, his eyes stayed fixed on James, and that alone was more healing than any response. It was then that James realized the deal he thought he made to save his ranch had quietly transformed into something much deeper. A quiet, stubborn commitment to heal, not just the land, but a boy who never asked to be saved, and a man who never thought he could. Tommy had no memory of peace, not really, not the kind that settles in your bones and lets you sleep without flinching. He remembered noise, loud metallic, shouts in a dialect he could never quite grasp, the way adults pointed more than they spoke, and the sting of belts, the drag of sweat, the scent of rust and bleach that clung to the clothes they made him wash in cracked tubs behind buildings that never had names. There was always work, always waiting, and always being moved around like cargo, border to border, van to van, until the concept of place lost meaning altogether and his body became the only home he trusted, and even that betrayed him sometimes. The man who called him Tommy wasn't the first to rename him. Before that, it was Chico, Raton, even Boy. Each name a code for what he was that week. A floor cleaner, a dishwasher, a boot shiner, and once, horribly, a bait boy at a fight ring where laughter and blood smelled the same. He learned early to make himself smaller, not to ask questions, to memorize exits and faces and moods, because the wrong look could mean no food, and the wrong word could mean worse. So when the tall man with the tired eyes bought him and drove him into a world where silence grew on fences and stars touched the ground, Tommy didn't dare hope for anything except less pain. But the ranch was different. At first, he thought it was just quieter abuse, the kind that unfolds slow and unpredictable like bad weather. But days turned to weeks and no hand was raised. No punishments were given for dropped tools or long blinks. And the man, James, did something no one ever had. He looked at Tommy like he wanted to understand him, not fix him, not use him, just understand. And that unsettled the boy more than any whip ever had. Trust wasn't a language he spoke, but his body began to relax in small ways, sleeping a little deeper, eating slower, standing a fraction taller when passing through doorways. And the memories, those were always there, stitched into muscle memory, like the way he flinched when anyone moved too fast, or how he instinctively hid food in his boots for later, or how he still avoided sitting with his back exposed. But in the spaces James created, unspoken and gentle, those memories stopped being rules and became just shadows. One afternoon, while oiling his saddle, Tommy remembered something strange. His mother's hands, the way she sang to the cactus plants she grew in windows, her voice soft and cracked like old vinyl, and it hit him like a fever, that he once belonged to someone, once had a name that wasn't for sale, and he began to hum the tune under his breath, a lullaby in a language he hadn't spoken in years, and James, hearing it from the barn, didn't interrupt, didn't ask, just listened. And in that moment Tommy knew he was safe, not forever, but for now. And that was more than he'd had since he was 6. Memories flooded in odd bursts. His sister's laughter in the alley where they played marbles, the sting of her scream the night they were taken, the image of her being pulled into a different van while he kicked and screamed and was beaten into silence. And every night, under the Texas stars, he'd stare at the ceiling of the shed, wondering if she was still alive, if she remembered his name, if she too was being called something else, and if, somewhere, she had found someone like James. But these thoughts were too dangerous to share, so he stored them quietly behind the same eyes that never cried, and the same voice that rarely rose above a whisper. Yet James noticed, always noticed, the faraway look, the sudden pauses, the clenched fists at night, and instead of pressing, he simply began leaving more things behind. A book in Spanish, a small flashlight, a note written in crooked handwriting that read, "You're doing good, kid." And while Tommy didn't cry, something inside him softened, like snow on desert sand. And slowly, the ranch began to feel like something between a sanctuary and a mirror. Its broken fences reminded him of his own boundaries, its tired animals of his own resilience, and its quiet man of the kind of protector he never imagined existed. He started watching James too, not just how he worked, but how he sat alone on the porch with a look that didn't beg for sympathy but carried sadness like an old friend. And Tommy, in his own way, began to help not just with chores, but with presence, by being near, by existing, by surviving beside this man who carried guilt like a second skin. And one day, while fixing the fence near the back pasture, Tommy found something strange buried beneath the soil. A rusted toy truck, its paint chipped but wheels intact, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he cleaned it and left it by the porch, not knowing that it belonged to James's son who died at birth, a child James never got to raise, a memory too painful to voice. And when James saw it, he didn't say anything, just sat beside it for hours, hand resting gently on the metal, and Tommy knew he had given something back without meaning to. These kinds of exchanges, silent, symbolic, became their language, a way to stitch two wounded lives into something resembling meaning. And though no one would see it from outside, from the dust-covered gate or the crumbling fence line, inside the ranch was healing happening, slowly, painfully, honestly. Tommy still didn't speak much, but he began to write. Scribbled notes in the margins of feed logs, small drawings of horses and barns and stars, a kind of diary in fragments that James never touched but always noticed, and every page felt like a reclamation, a way of saying, I exist, I remember, I am becoming. And though he never spoke his real name aloud, he wrote it once, on the inside, of a feed bag, Mateo. And when James saw it, he didn't ask questions, didn't react, just started calling him Tommy, a little less, and Kid a little more, as if waiting for the boy to choose when he wanted to be seen. In those moments, Mateo felt something strange. Not freedom, not yet, but the beginning of it. The way a caged bird feels the wind before the door opens, and he clung to that feeling like a compass, like maybe, just maybe, the world could still be a place where names meant something, where people stayed, where home wasn't a punishment but a promise. And in the quiet rhythm of the ranch, between the labor and the silence, a boy who had been trafficked, renamed, beaten, and forgotten began, very slowly, to reclaim his own name, and with it, a piece of the life he was never supposed to have. The bond between James and the boy Mateo, though only James knew the name now, grew not from ease or shared smiles, but from hardship, from routines that bruised their hands and silences that thickened the air like dust after a stampede, because healing never happens all at once, and trust is a slow, uneven thing, stitched together in moments of vulnerability that neither of them knew how to name. James still struggled to look the boy in the eyes for too long, partly out of guilt, partly out of a fear that if he did, he might see something too familiar, something like himself. And Mateo, though he worked beside James every day, still flinched when a door slammed, still refused to take off his boots at night, still kept the peanut butter jars hidden under the shed floor just in case this all disappeared and he had to run again. Their connection was forged like old iron, through heat, pressure, and time, and it wasn't until a small incident with a barbed wire fence that things began to shift. James had sliced his forearm trying to loosen a tangled section near the north ridge, cursing softly under his breath, and before he could stop the bleeding, Mateo was there with a clean rag, wrapping the wound with trembling hands, and James saw for the first time that the boy knew how to bandage injuries too well, like he'd done it many times before, and James didn't ask. But his hand lingered on the boy's shoulder for just a moment longer than usual, and that touch, that silent thank you, was a seismic gesture in their strange, evolving relationship. The next morning, Mateo left a cup of coffee for James on the porch. Too much sugar, lukewarm, but perfect in its intent. And from that day on, coffee became their morning ritual, a way to say, "I'm still here," without needing to explain why. But there were still tensions, moments when Mateo recoiled from simple kindness, when James raised his voice at a broken gate, and the boy disappeared for hours, hiding in the loft like a wounded animal, only returning when the sun sank low enough to erase the outlines of fear. James tried to apologize, but didn't know how. So instead, he left a sandwich wrapped in wax paper with a note that read, "My fault. I'll fix the gate myself." And though the note was gone by the next day, Mateo didn't speak of it, only brought him the right wrench later that afternoon without being asked. These were their apologies, their compromises, their offerings. Neither man nor boy spoke about what came before. James never mentioned the bottle he hadn't touched since the boy arrived, and Mateo never spoke of the bruises that healed too fast for concern. But their actions told stories no one else could hear. They worked, side by side through August heat, through broken fence posts and half-dead cattle, and though the ranch still stood on the edge of collapse, something within it had begun to root itself again, not in profit, not in survival, but in the kind of quiet, defiant companionship that only two broken people could offer each other. Still, James worried about what would happen if someone came asking, if child services caught wind, if some government official showed up demanding paperwork James didn't have. And every time a truck drove up the gravel road, his chest tightened, not for himself, but for the boy, for what might be taken from him, what might be forced upon him again. And those fears began to stir something deeper, a kind of protective anger James hadn't felt since his wife lost their baby, and the hospital clerk misspelled the name on the birth certificate. James had never been much for laws. He followed them when they made sense and ignored them when they didn't. But with the boy, things were different. He didn't just want to protect him physically. He wanted to give him something real, something legal, something that couldn't be taken away with a knock on the door. And that's when the thought first crept into his mind. Adoption, guardianship, some way to make the boy's presence official. But he dismissed it as fantasy, as something only men with clean records and white collars could manage. And besides, The boy didn't even speak, hadn't shared his full name, and James had no way of proving how he came into his care that wouldn't damn him in court. Still, the idea lingered, tugging at him in moments of quiet, like the night he found Mateo watching the stars from the corral fence, legs swinging gently, face lit by moonlight, and James, without thinking, said, "You ever wonder what it'd be like to stay somewhere forever?" The boy didn't answer, but he didn't leave either, and that silence said more than words. The uneasy bond they shared wasn't without its cracks. James had moments where his own temper got the better of him, snapping over broken tools or misplaced feed, only to see the boy retreat inward again, shrinking like paper in flame. And each time, James hated himself a little more, realizing how thin the line was between fear and familiarity, and how hard it was to undo what others had done Mateo for. His part still struggled with kindness, accepting it, trusting it, believing it wouldn't turn sharp. And though he never spoke it aloud, James could see it in the way the boy stiffened when offered help, how he watched every hand as if it might turn on him, how he kept inventory of exits in every room, like a soldier in enemy territory. But over time, those edges dulled, not gone, but less jagged, and one evening, as they fixed the porch railing together, James handed him a nail and said, "I'm glad you're here." And the boy didn't look up, didn't nod, but his hand stopped shaking for the first time in days, and that was enough. They were two people walking parallel paths, sometimes close, sometimes distant, bound by more than circumstance, but still afraid of what would happen if they let down their walls completely. And it was in that tension, that uncertain, imperfect love, that their uneasy bond continued to grow, like weeds through concrete, stubborn, messy, and miraculous. The first real connection came not with a grand gesture or a dramatic event, but through something deceptively small, something that began, like most things on the ranch, in silence. The tractor had broken down again, its engine sputtering in protest as James tried to coax life out of its rusted bones, and after half an hour of sweat, curses, and oil-stained hands, he kicked the tire in frustration and muttered under his breath, "Damn thing's more stubborn than I am." Not expecting a response, but releasing the truth anyway. And that's when it happened. A sound, low and unsure, floated out from behind the barn wall. A single chuckle, barely a breath, but unmistakably a laugh. And James froze, unsure if he'd imagined it, if the wind had played tricks on him. But when he turned, there was Mateo, crouched with a wrench in his hand and the shadow of a smile on his face, his eyes bright with something James hadn't seen before, lightness, mirth, humanity. And for a heartbeat, time stilled not, because laughter was rare though it was, but because in that moment, the boy wasn't surviving. He was living, reacting, choosing to let down his guard just enough to share a flicker of amusement. And James, overwhelmed by how fragile and beautiful that small crack in the armor was, laughed too, not loud, not performative, but a laugh filled with gratitude and awe. From then on, things began to change. Not all at once, not in bold strokes, but in the soft layering of shared life. Mateo began, humming more freely, tapping rhythms on fence posts as he worked, even mimicking James's sarcastic remarks with facial expressions that bordered on playful. And James responded in kind, allowing himself to enjoy their routines not just as labor, but as moments of companionship, of building something together that went beyond cattle and fences. One Sunday, James drove into town for supplies and returned with 2 ice creams, 1 chocolate, 1 vanilla, leaving the second on the porch beside Mateo's. Boots without a word, and later that night, when the wrapper was gone and the stick rested neatly on the step, James didn't need thanks, didn't need acknowledgement, because the act had been received, and that was everything. A few weeks later, after a long day branding cattle, they sat in the barn sipping cold sodas and watching the sky bleed orange across the fields, and James, moved by something he couldn't quite explain, began to tell the boy about his son, the one who never made it past the delivery room, the one who'd been named Caleb before he ever took a breath, and how his wife had folded in on herself after the loss, leaving James alone with grief and guilt and acres of silence. And as he spoke, voice low and even, Mateo didn't move or speak, but tears slowly welled in his eyes, not falling, just sitting there like little witnesses to a pain he understood too well. James didn't notice at first, but when he did, he paused, not to apologize, but to sit beside the boy quietly, shoulder to shoulder, letting the silence carry what words could not. And in that pause, something passed between them, something raw and real, a shared grief that transcended language or legality. The next morning, James found the boy's old notebook, the one filled with drawings and doodles, open on the workbench, and on one of the pages was a sketch of a child holding a lasso, smiling beside a stick-figure adult with a cowboy hat, beneath which was scrawled, in broken English, "Caleb is with stars. I with you." And James, holding that paper, felt his heart swell with a kind of broken joy, because the boy had given him something sacred, his empathy, his acknowledgement, his presence. And in return, James vowed, silently but with full conviction, that he would do everything in his power to protect this child, to ensure he would never be abandoned again. The connection deepened from there, not in speeches or confessions, but in routines layered with meaning. Mateo began riding the mare James once thought too wild, coaxing her gently across the pasture with quiet confidence, while James, in turn, began teaching him more complex tasks, balancing the books, operating machinery, even reading ranch maps. And with every new lesson, Mateo stood a little taller, his movements a little less hesitant, and for the first time since arriving, he began initiating things, setting out tools before James asked, suggesting fence repairs, once even pulling James away from a broken feed chute, just seconds before it collapsed. These weren't just acts of helpfulness, they were acts of belonging, signs that the boy no longer saw himself as an outsider, as a burden, but as part of the ranch, part of the rhythm, part of the man who had unknowingly become his guardian. And then came the moment that would seal their bond in something deeper than shared labor. A storm rolled in one night, sudden and violent, tearing down part of the north fence and spooking the livestock, and James, rushing to corral the horses, slipped in the mud and struck his head against a trough, hard enough to black out for a moment, hard enough to draw blood. And when he came to, he was in the barn, lying on hay, his wound bandaged, and beside him was Mateo, eyes wide with fear but steady, whispering, "You up, James?" And the name, spoken aloud for the first time, hit James harder than the fall ever could, because it wasn't just speech, it was choice. It was the boy deciding to break the silence, to cross the line of safety he'd drawn around himself for so long. And James, tears rising to his eyes, nodded and gripped the boy's hand, not as a thank you, not even as a father might, but as a man saying, "I'm here. I see you. We're not alone anymore." And from that night on, the silence between them changed, no longer a barrier, but a language all its own, filled with shared glances, quiet laughs, and the growing understanding that whatever brought them together, purchase, desperation, tragedy, it had transformed into something neither of them had dared hope for, a true, undeniable connection between two people who had both, in very different ways, been left behind by the world. The morning that changed everything began like any other, with the sound of the wind brushing against the broken shutters, and the scent of coffee drifting lazily through the screen door. But beneath that familiar rhythm, there was a stillness in the air, the kind that settles just before a storm, and James, though he couldn't name it, felt it in his bones. Mateo was already outside, feeding the horses, with a quiet hum on his lips, and James stood on the porch watching him with something close to pride, a pride he rarely allowed himself to feel, because he still carried the weight of how this all began, how the boy came into his life not by fate, but by transaction, a truth that made his small daily joys feel stained, even now. But today was different, and James didn't know why until he saw the envelope tucked under the front doormat. No stamp, no address, just his name in thick, unfamiliar handwriting. He opened it casually at first, expecting a bill or a flyer, but the first line knocked a breath from his chest. "You're harboring a stolen child." And as he read the rest, his hands began to tremble, because whoever wrote it knew everything. Mateo's real name, his age, the place he'd been taken from 3 years ago, even the name of his older sister, Elena, who had been searching for him since the night they were separated. There were no threats, no demands, just information and a final line that gutted James to the core. "If you care about him, You'll do the right thing. And suddenly, everything he thought he knew about the boy, about what they were building, came crashing into 1,000 pieces, not because it wasn't real, but because it wasn't complete. He stood there in a fog, the paper shaking in his grip, and when Mateo came up the steps holding a wrench, James turned instinctively, hiding the letter behind his back, offering a strained smile that the boy didn't quite believe. But he didn't press, just tilted his head slightly and returned to the shed, and James felt the acid of guilt rise in his throat. He spent the rest of the day pacing, folding and unfolding the letter, trying to decide whether to tell the boy, whether to risk destroying the fragile piece they'd built. And when night came, he sat at the kitchen table, letter laid bare, whiskey glass untouched, and stared into nothing. By morning, the decision had made itself. Mateo deserved to know, no matter what it cost. And when James found him repairing the chicken coop, he knelt beside him, slower now, like approaching a wild animal, and said softly, "I need to talk to you, son." The word son hanging in the air like a question, like a plea. And Mateo froze, tool still in his lap, eyes wide but unreadable, and James handed him the letter without a word, watching as the boy's eyes scanned the page, slower, until he stopped breathing altogether and dropped the paper like it burned. "Elena," he whispered, not in English, but in the raw Spanish of his first life, his real life. And then she's alive. And James, stunned to hear the voice he'd come to love speak so many words, nodded slowly, saying, "She never stopped looking for you." And in that moment, the boy didn't cry or shout or run. He simply sat back, eyes vacant, as if the world had cracked open beneath him and he was still deciding whether to fall or fly. The days that followed were the hardest James had ever known, not because of silence, but because of the noise inside them both, the thundering chaos of questions neither had asked before. Would Mateo leave? Should he? What did it mean if he stayed? What did it mean if he didn't? And James found himself reliving every moment since the boy arrived, wondering if anything he'd done had truly been enough to erase the original sin of buying a child. And Mateo, for his part, began waking up at night, walking the property like a ghost, eyes searching the horizon for a sister he could barely remember but never stopped loving. He asked James questions now, tentative, probing ones, about the letter, about the people who wrote it, about what James knew when he first brought him home. And James answered honestly, painfully, admitting that he had known almost nothing, that at the time, it felt like survival, but now it felt like theft, even if his intentions had changed, even if love had grown where desperation once lived. Then, one morning, Mateo asked the question James feared most. "If she comes, do I go?" And James, who had rehearsed every possible answer, found himself saying the one thing he hadn't prepared for. "Only if that's what you want, Mateo. Only if you choose to." And the boy, hearing his real name from James's lips, blinked slowly, as if tasting it for the first time, and nodded, but offered no decision. The letter had included a number, a contact, and James had not yet dialed it, partly out of fear, partly out of selfishness. And one evening, under a lavender sky, Mateo handed him the old landline and said, "Call her. I want to hear her voice." And James, with trembling fingers, dialed the number, heart pounding as it rang. And when a woman answered in soft Spanish, the boy took the phone and whispered, "Elena?" And the silence that followed was so thick James thought the line had gone dead. But then, through the static, came the unmistakable sound of a sob, a gasp, and a voice crying, "Mateo, is it really you?" And the boy, breaking for the first time in years, began to cry, not quietly, not reserved, but loud, guttural sobs that came from somewhere ancient, somewhere only a sibling's love could reach. And James turned away, tears in his own eyes, letting the boy have that sacred moment without witness. After the call, things moved quickly. Elena was living 3 states away, married now, working at a nonprofit for displaced families, and she wanted to come immediately, to see her brother, to bring him home. And James, heartbreaking and mending all at once, said yes, of course yes, because what else could he say? Even if every fiber of his being wanted to hold onto the boy who had become his purpose, his redemption, his second chance. And so, for the first time in a long while, The ranch prepared not for survival, but for goodbye. And both man and boy moved through those final days with a tenderness that felt almost holy, sharing meals, building a birdhouse together, carving names into the fence post near the barn. J plus M, not as owner and property, not even as guardian and child, but as two souls who had saved each other in the unlikeliest of ways. And when Elena finally arrived, stepping out of a dusty silver car with tears in her eyes and arms wide open, Mateo ran to her, without hesitation, burying his face in her neck. And James, watching from the porch, knew that he had done the right thing, even if it broke him, because love, real love, is about letting go when the time comes. And as the sun set behind them, casting gold over the field, James turned toward the barn, alone again, but not empty, because this time, the leaving wasn't a loss. It was a gift, and somewhere deep inside, he knew this story wasn't over. The silence that returned to the ranch after Mateo left with Elena wasn't the kind James had grown used to, not the quiet of routine or solitude, but a sharp, echoing void that rang in every corner of the house and every stall of the barn, like grief refusing to settle down. It was the silence of loss, yes, but not the clean loss of death or distance. It was the hollow ache of letting go with love still blooming in your chest. And James, for all his pride and stoic nature, could not hide from it, couldn't walk it off or bury it in work, because everywhere he turned, there were fingerprints of the boy he hadn't realized had changed him so completely. The half-finished birdhouse, still resting on the porch, the flannel blanket folded too neatly on the shed floor, the childish sketches of cows and crooked fences tacked to the feed-room wall with old nails. At first, James tried to move forward with what he knew best, labor, rising before dawn, repairing broken irrigation lines, tending to livestock, and forcing himself through each task like it might scrub away the ache. But it didn't, and by the end of each day, he found himself sitting on the porch with the guitar he hadn't touched since Mateo had first placed it beside him, strumming nothing, just holding it like a relic, because that's what the ranch had become. Not just a place of work or inheritance, but a museum of what had been briefly possible. The worst moments came at night, when James would wake thinking he heard humming from the shed, or the soft shuffle of boots across the dirt path, only to find the yard empty, the sky cruelly quiet, and the stars above no longer offering peace, but reminders of a boy who once watched them with wonder and longing guilt. Settled in next, not fresh guilt, but an old wound reopened, because James couldn't shake the feeling that he had taken too long to do the right thing, that Mateo's departure, though necessary, came too late, that if he had acted sooner, if he had called sooner, maybe the boy wouldn't have had to carry so much of his own rescue. He replayed their last days over and over in his head, the way Mateo had smiled as he taught James how to say hermano properly, the long silence between them as they packed up the few belongings the boy chose to take, the final look he gave James before climbing into Elena's car, a look that said thank you, and also I'm sorry, and also you were enough. And James clung to that look like a compass, because it was all he had left. He tried writing a letter once, addressed to Mateo but never sent, and in it he confessed things he'd never said aloud, that the boy had made him a better man, that he didn't regret a single day of their time together, and that he would keep the ranch standing not just for legacy, but for memory. But even writing those words felt insufficient, and the paper sat crumpled on his desk for weeks before he burned it in the fireplace, one rain-heavy night, the ash swirling like ghosts. Meanwhile, Elena called once, a gentle, nervous voice on the line thanking him for what he'd done, for not turning Mateo in, for giving him something like home in a world that had stripped him of it too early. And though James appreciated her words, he couldn't stop thinking that it was Mateo who had done the giving, not him. The days bled into each other. Work became mechanical, and the joy that had once crept into James's life in the shape of a small, quiet boy faded into memory, but grief, as it often does, began to change form, no longer a sharp ache but a dull pull, a weight he carried not with resentment but with reverence, and slowly, that grief gave way to purpose. James began fixing up parts of the ranch he'd long neglected, not for profit, not even for utility, but because he imagined what Mateo might say if he saw the place now, how he might grin at the new coat of paint on the barn or the repaired windmill at the east fence line. And in that imagining, James began to feel less alone. He took to journaling, short entries about the weather, the cattle, and sometimes just a sentence or two about what he missed. Mateo's hum in the morning, the way he handled the mare, his silence that didn't feel emptied. And in writing, he began to heal, not by forgetting, but by holding space for what had been real. Then came the unexpected letter, a real one this time, stamped and sealed and addressed in careful handwriting that made James's heart stop. It was from Mateo, now living in New Mexico with Elena, attending school for the first time in years, learning English properly, making friends, even joining a small art club where he drew scenes from the ranch, including one sketch of James himself, standing beside a horse, tall and quiet with a hat pulled low over his eyes. And in the letter, Mateo didn't say much, just a few lines. I miss the ranch. I miss you. I'm doing okay. Thank you for letting me choose. You were my first safe place. And James, reading it under the wide open sky, wept, not because of regret, but because of the rare beauty of being part of someone's rescue, of offering shelter not forever, but just long enough for wings to grow. And with that, he folded the letter, placed it inside the notebook where Mateo once doodled, and went back to work, because there was still life here, still land to care for, still stories to write in the dust and wood and wind. And though the boy was gone, the bond remained, not uneasy anymore, but solid, true, and etched into every corner of the ranch like a quiet promise. That love, even when let go, never truly leaves. Redemption was never something James had believed in, not really, not in the biblical sense or the fairy tale kind, because for most of his life, consequences had felt more like permanent ink than chalk that could ever be erased. But after Mateo left, after the ranch settled back into its creaking rhythm, James began to feel something tugging at him deeper than grief and older than guilt. The need to atone, not for anyone's judgment, but for his own. Because while Mateo had been given back to the world, James knew he had taken something that could never be returned in full. And the only way he could live with himself now was to make sure no one else ever had to be bought the way that boy had been. It started with research. Late nights at the dusty town library, combing through outdated records on trafficking and labor rings, connecting dots that local law enforcement had ignored or pretended didn't exist, and what he found infuriated him. Dozens of reports dismissed, children shuffled from town to town, and no one ever held accountable. Not because there wasn't evidence, but because there wasn't interest, and that was the fire James needed. He started calling nonprofits, ones Elena had mentioned during their brief phone call, and after weeks of leaving messages and emails, he finally got a meeting with a small regional advocacy group working to expose trafficking in rural corridors, the kind of cases buried under bureaucracy and shame. And when James drove 4 hours to meet them, worn boots tapping nervously in the reception room, he didn't come to be thanked or pitied. He came to offer everything he knew. The man who sold Mateo, the junkyard compound, the faces he remembered, even sketches he'd traced from memory of the layout, the transport trucks, the license plate fragments he'd memorized, without knowing why. And the advocates listened, not with skepticism but with urgent gratitude, because James was the missing witness they hadn't known they needed, someone from the inside who hadn't just looked away. And from that moment, James became something he'd never envisioned, a whistleblower, an informant, a quiet warrior for children who had no voice. And though the work was slow and often painful, every memory a wound reopened, he pushed forward, not because he wanted to be a hero, but because Mateo had taught him what it meant to belong to someone, even if only for a season, and now he had to make sure others found that same safety, that same choice. Meanwhile, Mateo was adjusting to his new life with a kind of resilience only trauma survivors possess, excelling at school despite a late start, speaking more each day, finding in his sister the mirror of himself he thought was lost forever. And though he didn't write often, his updates reached James in subtle ways. A photo of a school art project depicting the ranch, a voicemail on James's old flip phone where Mateo shyly said, "Happy birthday," before hanging up, a package one spring morning containing a worn bracelet the boy had once woven from baling twine, something he'd never let James see him make, now offered back like a memory too precious to keep alone. James wore the bracelet tucked inside his shirt collar, close to the heart, and on days when the guilt returned, the kind that whispered, "You still bought him." He touched the bracelet and reminded himself that love had grown there too, fierce and messy and real. And then came the moment that made all the slow-burning redemption feel tangible. The federal task force, the one James had fueled with his testimony and sketches, finally made arrests, raiding a compound not far from the very place James had once driven to out of desperation, rescuing 9 children and uncovering documents that traced back to dozens more, including Mateo. And James was asked, gently, if he wanted to attend the trial, to stand and give a statement. And at first he declined, afraid it would break him, afraid it would drag him backward into the shame. But then he remembered Mateo's voice, small and certain, saying, "You let me choose." And James realized he had to choose now too, not to bury the past, but to name it, confront it. And so he went, sitting stiff in a federal courtroom, boots too loud on the marble floors. And when he took the stand, he spoke not like a victim, not like a hero, but like a man who once made a terrible choice and then chose to do better, who once bought a child and then gave him back to the world more whole than he found him. And when the judge nodded solemnly at the end of his testimony, James didn't feel absolution, but he did feel peace, and that was enough. Afterward, he drove straight home, parked the truck, and found himself walking without thinking to the old wooden fence where he and Mateo had carved their initials, running his hand over the grooves like they were scripture. And then, in a quiet moment beneath the setting sun, he saw a figure walking up the gravel path, small, lean, steady. And at first he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, but then he saw the eyes, steady and searching, and his heart jumped in his chest, because it was Mateo, older now, taller, but undeniably him. And behind him was Elena, smiling gently, watching from a distance, and James didn't move, couldn't move, until the boy, no, the young man, reached him and said softly, "You fixed the fence." And James, throat tight, managed only a nod before Mateo reached out and hugged him. Not a child's hug, not hesitant or fragile, but strong and certain. And James broke then, arms wrapping around him as if to hold time itself. And the two stood there in the dust and golden light, not as buyer and survivor, not even as father and son, but as men who had saved each other and now stood on equal ground, bound by choice, by redemption, by love. And though Mateo didn't stay long, just a day and night, it was enough to walk the ranch together, to see the repairs James had made, to share a meal in silence that now felt warm, not empty. And when Mateo left again, it was different, because this time he promised to come back. And James believed him, because this wasn't goodbye, this was continuation. And for the first time in his life, James believed that redemption wasn't about undoing the past. It was about doing right with what remained. The turning point didn't arrive with fanfare or dramatic confrontation. It came, as most irreversible things do, wrapped in the ordinary, disguised as a chore, on a late spring morning when the sun had yet to burn off the fog and the earth still smelled of dew and old wood. James had risen early to mend a piece of fencing near the east pasture, a section he and Mateo had once planned to rebuild but never got around to. And though the boy had only visited once since leaving with Elena, his presence lingered like weather, never fully gone, always shifting. And that morning, as James hammered a new post into place, he noticed something strange in the soil, an object half buried, smooth and flat, not a rock or bone but a piece of metal, old and corroded. And when he unearthed it fully, he saw that it was part of an old branding iron, twisted and broken at the neck, the initials on it no longer legible. But James knew, instinctively, that it was his father's, a relic of the man who'd taught him how to brand cattle with pride and force, who believed in legacy and punishment more than nurture. And holding it in his hands, James felt the weight of all he had inherited and all he had chosen to discard. The iron, once a symbol of ownership, of control, now lay useless in his palm. And without hesitation, James walked to the fire pit behind the barn, lit a slow-burning flame, and dropped the iron in like an offering, watching as the metal hissed and blackened. And for the first time he spoke aloud, not to anyone present, but to the ghosts of the land. "This place doesn't own anyone anymore." And the words, simple and firm, rang truer than any sermon he'd ever heard. That act, that burning, became a ritual of release, a commitment not just to the future, but to a different kind of past, one he would not repeat. And as the ashes cooled, James turned to see Elena walking up the gravel path, Mateo beside her again, unexpected but welcome, both of them carrying something in there. Faces that James hadn't seen before, resolution. They'd come not just to visit, but to talk, and over coffee on the porch, the three of them sat, awkward at first, until Elena pulled out a small folder and said, "Mateo's been thinking about his future, and about here." And James, bracing himself, listened as the boy explained in quiet, measured English that he didn't want to return permanently. Not yet, but he wanted to spend summers at the ranch, to help rebuild it into something safer, not just for animals, but for people, for boys like him, for kids who had nowhere else to go. And Elena, holding her brother's hand, added that they had been speaking to social workers and nonprofits, exploring the idea of turning the ranch into a transitional home, a place where survivors of trafficking and child labor could learn trades, find peace, and be treated like human beings. And James, speechless at first, blinked hard, because the idea was something he hadn't dared dream of, but had always, in some hidden part of his heart, longed for. He thought of the broken children he'd seen at the compound, the kids with eyes older than time, and imagined them here, learning to ride, to plant, to breathe again. And without hesitation, he said yes, whatever it takes. Yes, and so began a new kind of labor, not for profit but for purpose. And over the weeks that followed, James worked alongside volunteers, nonprofits, and neighbors who once gave him wary glances, but now lent hammers and time. And slowly, the ranch began to change, not in its bones, but in its spirit. The shed was turned into a studio, the barn loft into sleeping quarters, and the house, once too quiet, now buzzed with the laughter of kids, who spoke in fragments and hugs, who fixed fences and drew murals and planted herbs along the porch. Mateo returned that summer as promised, his presence no longer haunted but hopeful, teaching others how to rope, how to sketch, how to find calm in repetition. And James, watching him from the kitchen window one evening, realized that the boy who once worked in silence now led others with quiet strength, not because he wanted to be in charge, but because he knew how to hold space for pain without flinching. Their relationship shifted too, not from mentor to mentee or father to son, but to something horizontal, something that required no definition, just presence. And they began to share meals again, jokes again, moments again, and though they never spoke much about the past, it lived between them gently, like a quilt you don't need to unfold to feel its weight. One night, during a group campfire, a new boy asked James why he built this place, and James, pausing, looked over at Mateo across the flames, their eyes meeting, and simply said, "Because once I did the wrong thing, and then someone let me do the right thing." And the boy nodded, as if that made perfect sense, and passed him a marshmallow on a stick, and James, smiling quietly, accepted it. And that moment, that exchange, marked a true turning point. Not when the boy forgave the man, but when they both forgave themselves and let love grow not in the absence of pain, but in its wake. The summer sun was cruel the day the fire started, dry wind whipping across the northern pasture like a warning, stirring dust into the air and stealing the moisture from every breath. And though James had sensed that something was off all morning, it wasn't until one of the kids came sprinting from the back acreage, eyes wide, breath ragged, screaming smoke, that everything broke into motion. The blaze was fast, fed by drought-thick grasses and old fence lines soaked in oil from long-abandoned farm machinery. And by the time James reached the ridge, the fire had already begun its crawl across the field, licking up wooden posts like matchsticks and casting a sick orange glow over the dry sky. And for a split second, he froze, not from fear, but from memory, because in the flames he saw every risk he had ever taken, every mistake that had led him to this moment, and he knew, with searing clarity, that this fire wasn't just about land or livestock. It was a reckoning, a test of whether he could protect what he had built, whether he could finally be the kind of man he wished he'd been from the start. Shouting orders into the wind, James sent the younger kids toward the barn, barking instructions to Elena and the volunteers to turn on the backup water system and keep the horses away from the eastern gate. But the wind shifted, unpredictable and hungry, and in seconds, the fire had jumped the old cattle trench and roared toward the workshop, a new structure recently built, where Mateo and two boys were still inside, unaware, sketching plans for the new goat enclosure. And when James saw the smoke curling toward that building, he didn't think, didn't hesitate. He ran, legs moving like they had 30 years ago, lungs burning, boots pounding the dirt as he screamed Mateo's name, crashing through the side door just as the flames kissed the edge of the roof. Inside, heat choked the air, thick and blinding, and the boys, stunned by fear, huddled near the back as the room filled with smoke. Mateo, the only one moving, trying to open a window that wouldn't budge, yelling for them to crawl, to stay low. And when James burst in, eyes watering, face streaked with ash, their eyes met for one split second. Not father and son, not rescuer and rescued, just two men who knew exactly what had to be done. And without speaking, they began moving the kids, James grabbing one by the arm, Mateo guiding the other, shielding him with his body as debris rained from the ceiling and the flames hissed with rage. They reached the door, but just as James shoved the last boy out, a beam snapped loose from above, crashing between him and Mateo with a deafening crack, fire spraying like sparks from a forge. And James, panic ripping through his chest, shouted his name, but Mateo, coughing and covered in soot, waved him back and pointed to the side wall, motioning that he'd find another way. And James, against every instinct, every protective impulse, obeyed, dragging the others to safety before turning back, just in time to see Mateo kick through the side paneling of the workshop and crawl out, gasping, clutching his side, and collapse in the grass. James was at his side in seconds, hands trembling as he pulled the boy, no, the young man, into his arms, calling for water, for help, for anything. But Mateo, even in pain, managed to grin and muttered, "Told you I'm not fragile," before his body went limp from smoke inhalation. And James's world narrowed to the rhythm of a shallow, fading breath. The ambulance arrived 10 minutes later, Elena crying into her hands as the EMTs loaded Mateo onto a stretcher, and James, covered in ash and sweat and guilt, rode in the back, clutching the boy's hand, whispering, "You stay with me, kid, you hear? You stay." Over and over like a prayer, like a penance, like a plea. At the hospital, the hours crawled, James refusing to leave the waiting room, pacing like a man waiting for his own verdict. And when the doctor finally emerged, face drawn but calm, he said Mateo would recover. Minor burns, bruised ribs, a concussion, but alive. And James sank into the nearest chair, burying his face in his hands, sobbing not just from relief, but from the sheer magnitude of what almost was, of how close he came to losing the one thing that made him believe in redemption, in purpose, in love. Mateo spent 4 days in the hospital, quiet but recovering, and when James visited each afternoon, he brought with him a different object from the ranch, a horseshoe, a photo, a bag of their favorite trail mix, laying each one on the tray table like a breadcrumb path back to home. And on the 5th day, as Mateo stared out the window, he said softly, "I thought I'd be scared, but I wasn't. I wanted to protect them, like you protected me." And James, choking back emotion, whispered, "You did, Mateo. You became what I never was at your age. You became the man this place needed." And in that hospital room, as the sun cast long shadows across sterile floors, James realized that the fire hadn't destroyed what they'd built. It had tested it, revealed it, baptized it in smoke and sacrifice and stubborn, fire-forged love. When Mateo returned to the ranch, welcomed by cheers and hugs and cautious joy, the rebuilding began again, but this time with a deeper resolve, to make the land not just livable, but sacred, a place where sacrifice was honored, where pain was transformed into healing, where the scars they all carried became maps toward a future they never thought possible. And James, standing beneath the same sky that once witnessed his worst choices, now felt something he hadn't in years. Pride, not in the ranch, but in the boy who had grown into a protector, and in himself, for having finally learned what it meant to love someone more than fear, more than guilt, more than failure. The land had changed, not just in shape or color after the fire, but in essence as if the smoke had stripped away everything unnecessary and left behind only the truth of what it could become. And as James stood at the edge of the northern field weeks later, where blackened soil now bore the first green shoots of new growth, he felt something settle deep in his chest, a quiet certainty that this place, once built on legacy and pride, now pulsed with something softer, stronger, intention. The rebuilding had been slow but communal, with volunteers returning, neighbors donating, tools and fencing supplies, and even kids who had once been too scared to speak now offering ideas, sketches, laughter, and at the center of it all, not James, but Mateo, who moved through the ranch with a calm confidence that only comes from surviving what others cannot imagine and choosing, every day, to rise above it. He had started leading workshops, teaching other boys how to handle horses gently, how to draw their feelings when words failed, how to repair things without anger, lessons James once taught him, now passed down with even more grace. And James watched, sometimes from the porch, sometimes shoulder to shoulder in the barn, marveling not at what Mateo had become, but at who he had always been beneath the fear. Someone whole, someone good, someone meant to lead. Their relationship had evolved beyond the boundaries of guilt or roles. It was now built on choice, on mutual respect, on the kind of love that doesn't demand definition to be real. And when James told Mateo one evening, "This place is yours too, you know," the boy didn't respond with surprise or denial, only with a quiet nod and the words, "I know, but it's not just mine. It's for all of us." And James felt tears prick his eyes because the ranch, once a place of solitude and survival, had become a community, a sanctuary, and he hadn't even noticed when the shift occurred, only that it had. Elena visited often, helping with administrative paperwork, connecting the ranch to grants and social programs, and when a local journalist came to write a story on the project, it was her who insisted James be quoted, and though he was reluctant, he eventually sat for the interview, sharing only what was necessary, never using Mateo's full name, never claiming credit. But the story caught attention anyway, and soon letters began arriving from around the state. Former victims writing to say thank you, teachers asking how to help, even one old rancher who donated a brand-new tractor with a note that read, "For the boy who walked through fire and kept going." With each step forward, James felt his past loosen its grip, not because it vanished, but because it no longer ruled him. And one night, alone in the kitchen, he opened the drawer where he'd kept the original receipt from the day he bought Mateo, a yellowing slip of paper that had haunted him for years, and he burned it in the same fire pit where he'd melted the branding iron, watching it curl into ash with reverence and relief. And then came the day James hadn't prepared for, though he should have, when Mateo approached him after breakfast, hands in his pockets, eyes steady, and said, "I want to go back to school full-time in the city." And James, who had feared abandonment more than anything, felt a flicker of that old ache rise. But it didn't bloom into fear, because this time, the leaving wasn't about loss. It was about expansion, about trust, about knowing that the boy he once saved now chose his own future. And James smiled, pride and sorrow mingling, and said, "Then you go, and you come back when you want. This door never closes for you." And Mateo, voice low, replied, "I know. That's why I can leave." And just like that, the past that had once defined them both became a foundation, not a chain. And James, standing in the driveway as Mateo and Elena pulled away, didn't feel empty. He felt full, like something he planted years ago had finally bloomed. The ranch continued without him, of course. James still ran it. Kids still arrived. Wounds still healed slowly. But now it was sustained by something bigger than one man's redemption. It was sustained by legacy, not the kind passed down through blood, but through choice, through community, through acts of quiet love. And sometimes, at night, when the wind moved through the trees just right and the barn lantern flickered, James could still hear Mateo's humming from the shed, soft and low like a memory refusing to fade. And he'd close his eyes and smile, because what they'd built wasn't just shelter or safety or even family. It was freedom, and freedom, once shared, never disappears. It wasn't until years later, long after the fire scars had faded from the soil, long after the boys who once arrived in silence had grown into men who laughed easily, long after Mateo had graduated from community college and returned as a licensed youth counselor, that James finally allowed himself to sit still beneath the old elm tree at the edge of the pasture, the one that had somehow survived every drought, every storm, every fire, its roots too stubborn to die. And as he leaned against its rough bark and watched the sun spill gold across the fields, he felt the full weight of what they had built. Not just a working ranch, not just a shelter, but a living testament to what becomes possible when one man refuses to let his worst decision be the final one, and when one boy dares to believe that healing doesn't mean erasing pain, but carrying it forward with purpose. The ranch had grown beyond him now. There were directors and donors, policies and programs, but the soul of it remained what it always had been too. People, unlikely and imperfect, choosing each other day after day, even when everything around them had tried to strip them of that choice. Mateo's visits had become more frequent now, not out of obligation but out of love, and when he sat beside James on the porch one evening and said, "You know I tell the kids your story, right?" James had chuckled and replied, "Which part? The one where I almost ruined everything? Or the part where I tried to fix it too late?" And Mateo, quiet as always, had answered, "The part where you didn't quit. The part where you showed up, even when you didn't know how." And James, hearing that, had nodded with tears in his eyes, because that was all he had ever really hoped for. Not forgiveness, not admiration, but the chance to be remembered not by his failure, but by his fight to make it right. And now, as he sat beneath the elm tree, he thought of every boy who had passed through the ranch's gates, each one carrying the invisible weight of what had been done to them, and how, in time, they left with shoulders a little straighter, eyes a little brighter, a sense that they were not defined by the worst thing that had happened to them, nor by the hands that had failed to protect them, but by the ones who chose to see them as whole even before they believed it themselves. The ranch had become a home not by structure, but by spirit, and James, who once believed he had nothing left to offer the world, had instead become part of a legacy that would outlive him, not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to break, to rebuild, to begin again. He reached into his pocket then and pulled out the bracelet Mateo had made from twine so many years ago, now frayed and faded, but still intact, and he slipped it onto his wrist for the first time in months, not as a relic, but as a reminder that redemption isn't earned in a single act, but in the quiet, daily choosing to do better, to love harder, to stay when it's easier to run. He thought, too, of Elena, who had once feared she'd never find her brother again, and who now ran the administrative wing of the ranch with a fierceness that made every donor respect her. And he thought of the first boy they ever welcomed after the fire, a small, wide-eyed thing named Rico, who arrived clutching a broken toy car and who, within a year, was training new arrivals how to ride. And he smiled, because that was what mattered, that life had continued, that love had multiplied, that hope had taken root in a place where once there was only dust and debt and the bitter taste of regret. And finally, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James closed his eyes and whispered into the wind. Not a prayer, not a plea, just a promise. I didn't get it right the first time, but I kept trying, and that's what saved me. And as the wind carried his words across the pasture, through the trees, into the barns and the bunkhouses and the hearts of every soul who had ever called this place home, it became clear that this story, like the land itself, was no longer about loss or shame. It was about reclamation, about the power of chosen family, about the truth that even the worst of beginnings can lead to something holy when someone chooses love over silence, action over comfort, and redemption over despair.